Until 1930, no American had won the Nobel Prize in Literature. And in 1930, it went to Sinclair Lewis, who perhaps was one of the most unpopular choices ever made, because so many Americans thought that he had belittled American life, he had ridiculed the Midwest, he had satirized American culture. We're going to talk tonight and next week about Sinclair Lewis. Let's look first at his biography. And if you look at the sheets, you'll see that he was born in 1885 in Sauk Center, Minnesota, February 7th. We should be celebrating his birthday in a few days, actually. In 1902 or in 03, he attended Oberlin Academy, and then in 1903 matriculated at Yale College. It took him 5 years to graduate because he moved about, and he went on a trip on a cattle boat overseas to Liverpool, visited Upton Sinclair's experimental commune in Englewood, New Jersey, where he served as both a janitor and as a furnaceman. Interestingly enough, between 1907 and 1908, a year or 2 year period, he published 49 stories, poems, humorous articles. And he published them in a series of magazines called In the Smart Set, Life Magazine, Puck, The Transatlantic Tales, The Pacific Monthly, Youth's Companion, Century Magazine, The Delineator. Imagine having undergraduate students who, by the time they graduate, have published 49 separate pieces of literature. He graduated from Yale in 1908, and in 1910 to 1915, for a 5-year period, he was employed in New York at various publishing houses. He was earning $15 a week, and he spoke sarcastically in an autobiographical article that if he had stayed in 10 years, they may have promoted him to $25 a week. He wasn't interested in those kinds of salary pictures. His first novel came out in 1914, Our Mr. Wren, and in the same year he married Grace Livingston Heger, and 3 years later enjoyed the birth of his son Wells. Wells was born in 1944, he was killed in action in World War II. And that's, of course, one of the great loves of Sinclair Lewis's life and one of his moments of despair. In 1918, he was in St. Paul, Minnesota. In 1919 to 21, he moved to Washington. He was always looking for places to read about or write about. And of course, the scenes in Main Street where he discusses Washington undoubtedly knew this experience, because he published Main Street in 1920. And we'll talk about that work. In 1921 to 22, he published Babbitt. Main Street, of course, a story of a young woman living in Gopher Prairie and her experiences in trying to take a rather untutored and unlettered population and turning it into a sophisticated situation. Babbitt, on the other hand, is a story about a real estate man, a man who pokes around in real estate, who is looking for a good buck, looking to mix in with the finest economic circles, looking for financial advantage, always looking to improve himself, looking to buy his son a better car, and himself always visiting the finest barber shops. Babbitt is another one of Sinclair Lewis's satires we'll talk about in a few moments. From 1923 to 25, he was in Europe. But in 1924, he did an interesting thing. The Nation magazine asked him to write about the presidential election. The election that saw Calvert Coolidge running against John W. Davis and Robert La Follette. Now remember, Main Street had been written in 1920. In 1924, and of course it's a work of fiction, none of the characters in Main Street really existed. But in 1924, Sinclair Lewis goes back to Gopher Prairie, and he interviews the doctor, and he interviews Carey, he interviews Vida Sherwin, he interviews the people there to ask them their opinion about the presidential election. And through this fictional political device, he gives us some insight into his opinions. In 1925, he wrote Aerosmith. He published Aerosmith and was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in Literature, but he turned it down. The first American ever to decline the Pulitzer Prize. And why did he do it? He turned it down because he said, only the reader, only the public has a right to determine who are the great writers and what is the greatest book. He didn't like the idea of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch or any body of individuals saying that this was the greatest book and this is what people should read and this is a superior book to those others that were not chosen. Let me read you a few comments that he makes. His letter to the Pulitzer Prize Committee, because it's really quite interesting. He says, I wish to acknowledge your choice of my novel Aerosmith for the Pulitzer Prize. That prize I must refuse. And my refusal would be meaningless unless I explained the reasons. He says all prizes, like titles, are dangerous. The seekers for prizes tend to labor not for excellence, but for alien rewards. They tend to write this, or timorously to avoid writing that, in order to tickle the prejudices of a haphazard committee. He says the Pulitzer Prize for novels signifies already much more than a convenient $1,000 to be accepted by writers. There is a general belief, and this is what he really attacks, he says there is a general belief that the administrators of the prize are a pontifical body with the discernment and power to grant the prize as the ultimate proof of merit. It is believed that they're always guided by responsible critics. But he said it is absurd to suggest that any committee accepting and applauding one writer and ignoring others is authorized, commissioned, and permitted to make the decision about who shall win this prize. And so he, in fact, did refuse it, the first American to decline the Pulitzer Prize. In 1927, he separated from his wife and then published Elmer Gantry, a book which attacked ministers who pontificated. He attacked those who preached the word and didn't practice it themselves. He attacked charlatans in the ministry. He attacked phony fundraisers in religious societies. He attacked the premier fraud of all, Elmer Gantry. And it's a good book to read today in the age of tele-ministers who collect large sums of money from people and spend it on purposes other than their religious mission. In 1928, he divorced his first wife and married Dorothy Thompson, a journalist and writer in her own right, and then moved up to Vermont. In 1930, he won the Nobel Prize in Literature, but he did not reject that. In the same year, he enjoyed the birth of his second son, Michael. Now, I want to read to you some of his comments from his Nobel Prize speech. But before we get to that, I do want to mention a few other details of his life. He did in 1935, there was published a selected short stories of Sinclair Lewis, a selection of some 200 stories he had written to that date. He selected his own stories, and then he did not, in the future, collect his short stories. I think it's a good thesis, a good senior thesis, a good master's thesis, possibly a good doctoral dissertation, to look at many of the short stories that have not been published since they were originally issued in magazines, and deal with the character of Sinclair Lewis as a short story writer. He separated from Dorothy Thompson in 1937, and for the next 5 years traveled. In the winters he stayed in Manhattan. In the summers he went to the Midwest and Florida. During that time he wrote a play, Angela is 22, and in 1942 he was divorced from Dorothy Thompson. He published a book in 1943, Gideon Planish. In 1944, his son Wells was killed in battle. And then Lewis moved to Duluth, Minnesota. Other works of his, Cass Timberlane. And in the same year he published Cass Timberlane, he was the books editor for Esquire magazine. In 1946 to 49, he moved to Williamstown, Massachusetts. In 1947, while he was in Massachusetts, he published an interesting work called King's Blood Royal, where his protagonist discovers that though he is white, he has some Negro blood in him, a very small amount of Negro blood. And he decides then that his identity is really with his Negro descendants, his Negro forefathers, his Negro parents, his Negro ancestors. And the book really is an early voice in trying to identify the race issue in America. In 1948 he went to Italy, and in 1949 published The God Seeker. But in 1951 he died on January 10th. He was 66 years old at his death. Probably seemed old at the time. We found ways to extend life. There's no telling what he would have published afterwards, but the Nobel Prize Committee since, and other statements, and many, many other writers, critics, have felt that Sinclair Lewis never reached the power that he had achieved in those years when he did Aerosmith, Babbitt, and Main Street. Even Elmer Gantry, one critic says, was a very fine book, but it failed because Elmer Gantry had no true antagonist who could counter his powers, counter his viciousness, and who could counter his fraudulent action. It was a unilateral argument and a unilateral satire against the Elmer Gantrys of the world. But this critic claimed there was no positive force, there was no oppositional force that gave us an alternative perspective on the kinds of people who, in fact, could successfully counter the Elmer Gantrys of the world. Now, I want to spend a few moments before we go into Main Street in discussing the Nobel Prize speech. When he gave the speech, Sinclair Lewis said he realizes that there are many people who did not like him as a writer, who felt that he was sarcastic, satiric, and negative. He says, for example, now and then I have for my books or myself been warmly denounced. There was a good pastor in California who, upon reading my Elmer Gantry, desired to lead a mob to lynch me. Of course, Sinclair Lewis's irony is apparent. Why would a minister of God lead someone to lynch his critic? While in another state, a holy man in Maine wondered if there was no respectable and righteous way of putting me in jail. Now he goes on to describe the critics he has received, but then he goes on to talk about the people whom he really appreciates, and he mentions a number of writers whom he feels may be equally qualified and who perhaps should have won the Nobel Prize instead of himself. He comments, of course, that the war award should have been given to Thomas Mann. It was given in 1929, the year before Sinclair Lewis won it. He prides himself in joining Rudyard Kipling, who had won the war award in 1907, and George Bernard Shaw, who won it in 1925. But then he goes on to say, there are some writers in this country who deserve the award and who will probably not get it because either their writing is too challenging, too critical, too much a vituperative attack on American Puritanism and on American beneficence, on American idealism. He says Eugene O'Neill should get the award. Remember, this is 1930. O'Neill did get it in 1936. He says there's a young writer who really has changed literary context, but who deals with very sordid acts in his works, and he should get the award. And he named Ernest Hemingway. Well, it took 24 years for Hemingway to get the award in 1954. And he says, a writer who has taken the South out of hoop skirts should get the award, and that is William Faulkner. And indeed, William Faulkner got the award in 1949. So, in fact, we have a very interesting presentation in this Nobel Prize speech. Sinclair Lewis recognizing the fact that people oppose the award, thanking the Swedish Academy for giving him this notice even while his works were opposed in his own country. He suggests there are other writers who should get the award, but none of them did. He applauds Thomas Wolfe for Look Homeward Angel. He applauds John Dos Passo for USA. He speaks of Michael Gold, whom he says describes the Jewish East Side. He focuses and celebrates the works of James Joyce, who also did not receive the award. Well, Thomas Mann, who received it in 1929, he acknowledges. Selma Lagerlof, who received it in 1909. Roman Roland in 1915. He says Galsworthy should get the award. He got it in 1932, 2 years later. What Sinclair Lewis tells us is he has a good critical sense. He understands and values the work of his contemporaries. He can assess who is deserving. And while some of those whom he names did not win the award, certainly significant people whom he felt should get it, but who he feared would not, ultimately were recognized by the Academy. There's a great deal more we can say about Sinclair Lewis, about his technique, about his career, about his family, about his short stories. But we've chosen to focus on one novel, and we'll be doing that for 2 nights, and that is Sinclair Lewis's Main Street. We have 4 students in this class who will be delivering these introductions, who will be discussing individual chapters, who will be focusing on the plan and plot of Main Street. And the first who will be focusing on chapters 1 to 5 will be Miss Uno Portillo. What she has to say and how much she has to say, we'll learn in a few moments.
Thank you. Can you hear me with this? Do you know? Is there a way to check to see if you can hear me?
Very loudly.
Okay.
More than you think you should.
Okay. Thank you. As Dr. Rothman said, Main Street was written in 1920 by Sinclair Lewis, whose life spanned from 1885 to 1951. He was an American author, which is very interesting to me because it was in the 1920s, a period of history that really excites me. The President of the United States at the time was Woodrow Wilson. His administration was coming to an end. His administration lasted from 1913 to 1921. Some major historical events related to Main Street. That was a period of time, the 1920s, a period of time when the novel was published. It was the beginning of what is we consider modern times, modern America, America as we see it now. America as we've come to love her and know her, was born then. There was an interesting background issue that has changed all of our lives, the sex debate, starting with Margaret Sanger, who devoted her life to contraception, which gave rise to the sex debate, giving women more freedom and power over their over their body. Also giving birth to people like Carol Kennicott, who was very much more of a free spirit, more of a modern woman, more of what we would consider the 90s kind of woman now. It's a prototype. Also, the Prohibition was going on during that time. It was a period of urban growth, as is also the focus of the novel. The census of 1920 states that more Americans were dwelling in cities than in the country. Cigarettes, cosmetics, sex education, gossip columns, billboards, commercial, airlines, all of this was something that was growing in America at the time, and a lot of these things are mentioned in the novel. America became a consumer-driven society, also making Americans more cosmopolitan the way Carol Kennicott was, as opposed to the people of Gopher Prairie. Feminism was also a topic, so was Sigmund Freud. As far as Sinclair Lewis and significant events that would relate to Main Street, he was restless, as was the character Carol in his novel. As Dr. Rothman mentioned, he went through a lot of changes. He moved from place to place. He was a Renaissance man of the time. He faced practically every concern of readers from 1910 to 1950. He was a child raised in the turn of the century, but he wrote of escape into nature and of the past, and revolt of the village, and temptation of the city. He wanted to portray the changing roles of women. His book topped the bestsellers list, and he snubbed the Pulitzer Prize, but seeking and happily accepting the Nobel as the first American to win that award in literature, as Dr. Rothman said. He obsessively retold again and again the fable of our divided selves, bewildered amidst aspiration and achievement, is what one of the critics has said about him. Okay, Lewis's life has been separated into 3 different sections. The period of greatest achievement was that in which Main Street was published, and it says that he seemed to have prepared himself by exploring settings, characters, style, themes, and narrative modes. He had recreated the environments of Midwest and East of farms, villages, and city. He had found archetypical characters to his liking, young pioneers, seekers, and playful women, and had even tried out the satiric voices of preachers, businessmen, and professors. He once made the claim that he had begun writing Main Street in the summer of 1905 under the title Village Virus, but his biographer didn't believe that that was true, even though it had been written down in his diary. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little nervous up here. As he worked on Main Street in 1919, Lewis felt confident that he was at last achieving what he had set out to do from the beginning. His letters speak of excitement and of the long hours that he spent composing 8 hours a day, 7 days a week. So he's a maniac once he started writing this story, because as he had told it over and over, he just kind of changed it around a little bit. And okay. Throughout the novel, chapters 1 through 5 actually, you see Carol Kennicott's character, and she's the one that fascinates me the most, simply because, well, probably because I'm a woman and I can relate to her. I'm at a period of my life right now where I'm trying to find myself, and she seems like she was at that period of her life at the beginning of the novel. It said that she had a crush on a sociology instructor because he lived among celebrated reformers, was her idea. So she liked cosmopolitan men. She was one of those women who was sophisticated. She liked to read. She liked to experience life. And that showed, of course, in the beginning with her instructor that she had a crush on. Her goals were to be adventurous, much like Sinclair Lewis, who, trekked throughout Europe and everything during his adventures. And whenever she says her list of goals on page 9, she ends the way that a naive little schoolgirl would say. She says, "The days of pioneering, of lassies and sunbonnets, and bears killed with axes in piney clearings are deader now than Camelot, and a rebellious girl is a spirit." Oh, I'm sorry, it's the wrong page. Okay, at various times during senior year, Carol finally decided upon studying law, writing motion pictures, scenarios, professional nursing, and marrying an unidentified hero. That, to me, is very inspirational. It also mentions that she saw herself, Sinclair Lewis portrayed her as being an orphan after her father died. All she has was her sister. To me, that's almost foreshadowing Gopher Prairie in the sense that she doesn't feel comfortable there. She doesn't feel like she belonged there. She was always trying to change that. Even after her honeymoon, when she was coming home on the train, her first glimpse of Gopher Prairie, she was asking the doctor how she could bring everybody to life, which he didn't find any problems with it. He thought everybody was happy at the time. I believe the style of the work is satirical, even though it's hidden. Carol she's also not very, she's not the focus of Lewis's satire. I believe that comes later out throughout the novel with other characters. It's very realistic, the book is. I mean, you can pick it up and you can read it, and there's instances where Carol's asking herself through the third-person narrator, is asking herself, why is she thinking of Stuart at a time like this, whenever she was talking to the doctor? And that's real. I mean, that's something that we do nowadays, or like the show Ally McBeal. It reminds me of that show because it's very real. So, yes, Sinclair Lewis wrote very realistic. There's always a little voice in our head that's always asking us questions. Memorable quotation from the work. On page 10, this was when she was still at the university studying. Carol thinks of herself on a sociology field trip, and she sees the immaturity of her classmates, and she feels herself a great liberator. That's also foreshadowing. She wants to liberate the town. Okay. Some criticism about the novel. It says, we first see its heroine, Main Street's heroine, Carol Kennicott, as an unmarried college girl trying to find a career. She's been a great reader in romantic books and great fantasist of images from her reading. She dreams of the pioneer West and southern leaves, high-stacked steamers, and Dakota chiefs. While without a goal, she happens to meet Dr. Will Kennicott, a physician in the Minnesota village of Gopher Prairie, and she imagines that by bringing reform and artistic culture to the village, she can fulfill the missions of life. After she and the doctor marry, she enters the real situation that Gopher Prairie offers. She is shocked because the books have lied to her. They spoke of beautiful villages, picturesque villages, and that's really not what it ends up being. When she takes her first walk through the village, she observes broken yellow buildings, a greasy soda fountain, and a dusty jumble of toothbrushes and combs in the drugstore. Not at all what she'd envisioned. She hears nothing but gossip, trivial talk, and spite and prejudice from the people that live in the village. I mean, she's very, she doesn't feel very welcome. Okay, Lewis also, one of his main goals was to talk about the pressures of marriage, and I believe that he does that very well. There's instances in the book where Carol and the doctor get into fights that are little spats that most couples face even today. Couples probably weren't portrayed this way very much in books openly until probably the 1920s. Again, that was the modern era of America. When at the dinner party she's at the dinner party at Sam Clark's house, Carol is engaged in conversations that were probably elevated in topics, conversations that most women at the time probably would engage in. She speaks of union labor and profit sharing with Mr. Elder. She even goes on to talk about gold pantyhose, and which Dr. Kennicott finds problem with. He says that legs and immoral stuff, he basically thinks are immoral. That's also going back to the whole, the Victorian morals and the new woman of the 1920s, the modern woman, which Carol was emerging, and she didn't see any problem with it, but again, the Victorian morals of the small town life, they did have a problem with it. As she was walking home with the doctor, they had another spat about her shocking folks because he didn't want her to be criticized by anybody. I guess in short, it's safe to say that the character of Carol Kennicott, she's very real. She's what we would see as a modern woman. The book is very real. It, uses realism. In other words, real emotions, raw emotions, what we would see nowadays, what we would tell our friends, how we would write in a journal. It was a different way of writing that Sinclair Lewis and the authors of his time came up with, a time where, like of Ernest Hemingway, that wasn't seen before.
Thank you. Thank you, Miss Uno Portillo. There are a number of details, of course, in those first books. And you begin to identify yourself, and you begin to identify some of the important characters whom we are discussing. For example, we have Carol Milford Kennicott, this young idealistic woman who marries a doctor from Gopher Prairie. Her husband, Will Kennicott, is a pragmatic doctor. He's pragmatically minded. He appreciates country life. He fits in with the people. We meet in these pages Miles Bjornstam. He's a handyman in town, but a pariah, because he won't kowtow, he won't submit to the rich and the influential. He marries B. Sorensen, a working woman who bears him a son. And unfortunately, both of the mother and child ultimately die of typhoid fever. B. Sorensen, Carol hires as a maid, but treats her almost as an equal. And the other people in the town who don't think servants should be treated this way feel that Carrie is behaving badly and also paying her servants too much. We meet in these chapters Vida Sherwin. Vida taught French and English at the high school. She marries Ramey Witherspoon, and they become very, very loyal. Vida becomes one of the quiet people who actually gets things done in Gopher Prairie. Ramey Witherspoon is the first Gopher Prairie citizen to be honored in the war, and he returns a decorated hero. The episodes of these chapters are really quite important, as Miss Una Portillo has been pointing out to you. We realize certain contrasts. We realize that the first day at home, Carol takes a walk down Main Street, and she's really discouraged by what she sees as being a street that's drab, dirty, and unimaginative. Look on page 39, or look on chapter 4, where you just describe these homes on Main Street. And what Lewis is doing is putting in Carrie's mind and conveying to us through her what looks to be a drab town, a view, of course, that her husband and others who are natives of Gopher Prairie would never even think about. We see that she sees a small wooden motion picture theater called the Rosebud Movie Palace. Howland and Gould's Grocery, in the display window of black overripe bananas and lettuce on which a cat is sleeping. Dahl and Olison's Meat Market, which reeks of blood. A jewelry shop with tinny-looking wristwatches for women. In front of it, at the curb, a huge wooden clock which did not go. A fly-buzzing saloon with brilliant gold and enamel whiskey sign across the front, and other saloons down the block. From them a stink of stale beer, and thick voices bellowing pidgin German or twirling out dirty songs. A tobacco shop called the Smoke House, filled with young men shaking dice or cigarettes. A clothing store with a display of oxblood shade Oxfords with bulldog toes. The Bon-Ton store, Haydock and Simmons, the largest shop in town. The first story front of clear glass. The second story of tapestry brick. One window of excellent clothes for men. Newness and an obvious notion of neatness. Axel Egg's General Store, frequented by Scandinavian farmers. Sam Clark's Hardware Store, an air of frankly metallic enterprise, guns and churns and barrels of nails and beautiful shiny butcher knives. Chester Dashaway's house furnishing emporium. All this shops that people are accustomed to. And all of them look dismal, drab, uninteresting to Carol Kennicott. In chapter 5, we find that Will takes Carol hunting in the country. They visit a farmhouse owned by the Rustads. And Helga Rustad admires the doctor and his pretty wife. Carol falls in love again with her conquering husband because he's the doctor and he's so well respected. When they return to Mrs. Gurry's boarding house for supper, Carol meets the diners and talks to them about the arts. This makes Will uncomfortable. She knows too much, or at least she acts as though she knows too much in this small town. Vida Sherwin meets Carol, solicits her help in improving the town. But Vida suggests that Carol should work through the existing agencies instead of trying to revolutionize everything she doesn't like. She meets Guy Pollock, a lawyer. And Pollock, she finds, is interested in her words, interested in listening to her speak of artistic pursuits. Carol thinks she's part of the group. While the first 5 books are really offer an introduction to Carol, to her mentality, to her disaffection, to the problems she will face, and we realize that no matter how much she tries to get in, she's probably an outer. She's probably never fits in. But we'll learn more about this. Now we're going to move into the next part of this discussion. We're going to look at chapters 6 to 10, and Miss Heather Garcia is going to discuss these chapters.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Heather Garcia. I attend class out at the West Houston campus, so I haven't been down here before to meet any of you, but I'm all by myself over there watching you, so that can be comfort to you. Actually, I need one of these. I'm not going to reiterate all the details about Mr. Sinclair's life. Karina did a great job of that, and Mr. Rothman as well, Dr. Rothman, sorry. So I'll just start right in on my summary of chapter 6. Carol begins the chapter redecorating her home, or Dr. Kennicott's home, and she goes to Minneapolis and orders all of her supplies from outside. You know, she wants to really go to the height of style with her new decorations. So she does a Japanese motif in her living room area and brings in all these things from the big city. And of course, her neighbor indicates to her how she doesn't really approve of that, you know, the expense and the extravagance of the whole thing is really not acceptable practice in town. So, but she's still really excited about it. She decides to throw a party for her new friends, and that she's going to liven it up for them. She's going to, you know, show them the right way to have a party. So she orders in all this stuff from the big city again. She orders the food from grocery stores in Minneapolis. And she goes to a lot of expense and work making costumes and planning events for everyone so that they won't, you know, do their same old stunts, as she calls them. So everybody comes and they have this, you know, really great time. She has them do a square dance and they play this game where they're hunting for shoes in the dark. I'm not sure about that, but everybody seems to have this really great time. They have Chinese food. They dress in costumes and have a little music. And when everyone goes home, she's pleased to see later in the little neighborhood rag that, you know, her party got a good review. So She was real pleased about that. But I forgot to mention that before that, she and Will get into a confrontation about money. She has to go to the store to buy things, and she never has any money. And it's kind of unusual for her because she seemed so independent initially. So she really seemed to not, I was surprised to see her getting into the situation of having to go to him to ask for things, that she was entitled to as a partner in this relationship. But anyway, so she goes to ask him for the money, and they kind of have a confrontation about it, where she sees another wife, Mrs. Dyer, I believe it was, asking her husband for money, and they were all the men were kind of joking about it and how much power they had over their women. So, so she confronts her husband in private and indicates to him that he needs to be better about, proactively giving her money, not making her ask for it. And she indicates that she won't ask him again, that she'll just starve, and they won't have any groceries if she finds herself in that position again. So that's pretty much what happens in chapter 6. In chapter 7, she meets the handyman who seems to, she seems to develop a pretty good relationship with him. Oh, sorry. Later on, so I put that in as significant because they started talking at this point. But Carol starts to feel bored with town life and starts to have thoughts of reforming the town. She remembers how when she was a girl in college that she had planned to go to small towns and make some changes. So she starts to think about that a little bit. And then she starts to feel oppressed by the town. It's when she first starts to, she's just walking down the street and people don't seem to be as friendly as they did initially. She starts to feel like people are talking about her, like people are watching her. She has that moment of gaiety where she kind of hops on the curb and yells yippee, and she sees curtains shaking and people frowning at her, and she starts to feel a little bit caught in it. She seems so dual. One of the articles I read about this stressed Lewis's duality, and it seemed to me that that was a theme throughout this whole book. I mean, every single thing in it seemed to have two completely different sides to it. The town itself in one way seems so picturesque, and then in other ways seems so oppressive. And Carol herself in some ways seemed to be so independent and admirable in her intentions, and yet so flaky and so, I don't know, it was like one moment she's, just thrilled with everything and is so sure that everybody loves her, and the next minute, even though nothing has happened, it seems, she's completely convinced the other way. And then, Will seems to also have his both sides. In some ways, he seems like this great husband, very caring, supportive, earns a good living, does a good job, and yet he doesn't seem to really understand her. Anyway, that kind of goes off of my summary, but that's just what I'm thinking throughout this whole time. Then Carol goes to the meeting of the Jolly 17, where she really has a conflict. She gets there, and she hasn't ever learned bridge, and apparently this is a big problem for the women of the town. When she went to their party initially, she admitted to them that she didn't know bridge, but indicated she would learn it, and then the fact that she hadn't taken the time to learn it was very offensive to the women there. And while she wanted to kind of take this as an opportunity to talk with them and to share stories and to have conversation and maybe to invite them to do some things that she enjoyed doing out of doors, skiing and stuff, they really just wanted to play bridge and were pretty hurt that she hadn't taken the time to learn that. And additionally, she gets into some other arguments with the women there about, the bridge and then the library. She's speaking with the librarian there and indicates that she had some experience in the library, and the librarian says, well, we don't really approve of the way they do things in the big city. They let dirty, poor people come in, and we don't like that. And then they let the children come in and destroy the books. And they disagree really about what the role of the librarian is. Carol thinks that it is to instruct, to get people excited about reading, for the people. And the librarian thinks it's just for the books, that the librarian's job is to protect the books. So they get an argument about that. And then, later she has, I think, one more argument. About the maid, about how much she pays her maid. Everybody's angry with her for paying her maid so much, for making the other maids all want more money, that it's just ridiculous and extravagant the amount of money she's willing to spend for her maid. In chapter 8, Vida Sherwin, who has become her kind of confidant and her only person she feels comfortable with in town at this point, comes to her after the incident at the Jolly 17 and kind of well, it starts off by congratulating her for her, you know, for her little confrontation, but then really seems to come over and makes her feel, you know, just terrible, tells her all the bad things that are going around in town, how Mrs. Elder was so upset that she called her car little, and how everybody was upset she was so chummy with the maid, and how everybody at the party thought all her decorations and her extravagance and her food and her the way she decorated her home was just ridiculous. And you know, here she is just, you know, getting really beat up about it. You know, she's already having some doubts earlier about how she's perceived in the town, and she just kind of, you know, it just devastates her. She's just really broken by this. And then so she kind of tries to take comfort in her husband and say, well, you know, what do you think? Have you heard anything bad about me in the town? And he says that he didn't, and she's happy about that he still, regardless of how she knows she is perceived in the town, she's pleased that he, you know, cares enough about her to not see that. But at the same time, he tells her that really she should make more of an effort to spend her money in the town, to go to the people who go to him, you know, for their medical services, that she should do the same. And you know, she's like, well, I just really thought, you know, that they would appreciate some culture, and you know, and he indicates that he didn't think that. So so she's kind of squashed there again. In chapter 9, Carol's insecurity heightens. She really starts to get paranoid about everybody watching her, about everybody, you know, she walks in and they stop talking and she just knows they're talking about her, even about her new check suit, you know, that everything is just kind of going against her. And I'm sure, you know, some of it is, but it seems to me that some of it, you know, when you're feeling insecure, you're bound to see that everywhere, regardless of whether or not it's really there. But she does kind of redouble her efforts to be friendly to people, even though she feels like they're kind of stabbing her in the back. She really works hard to be friendly to them on the street, to be friendly to the grocers, even though she'd really rather go to other grocers and not confront these people at all. But then, you know, she's kind of squashed one more time. She goes into her barn, the neighbor boys are out there, and they're talking about her in, you know, very familiar terms, that they've noticed her ankles, that they've seen her when she doesn't pull the shades at her house, and she just, you know, is a basket case. Then she runs in and, you know, pulls all the blinds and just, you know, everybody's watching me. She's so upset about it. Will and Carol go out of town to visit his mother, which is just a really relief for her. I don't remember how she refers to it, but it's kind of like, she said, when a sick man or a dying man feels you know, looks forward to the reprieve of death or something. So it's really a good time for her. And then all this time throughout the chapter, Vida Sherwin kind of keeps coming by and going, well, you know, somebody thus and such said you were nice today, or, you know, this person told me that you had nice hair, or something like that. So she's, you know, it seems like she's kind of trying to, you know, build her back up a little bit, and she starts to gain some confidence again, it seems like, towards the end of the chapter. In chapter 10, she starts to feel lonely again. Her husband is out of town, and she's at this point feeling kind of close to him, so she really misses him in his absence. She really wishes somebody would come by and have tea with her, so pathetically she kind of sets up a table for two, you know, like a little girl having a tea party, and just wishes with all her heart that somebody would come by to share it with her. But when that doesn't happen, she starts again towards her thoughts of reforming the town. She decides to begin with her husband. She feels like if she could teach him to appreciate poetry, that would be a really good start. So, so she starts to plan on that. And then, excuse me, she takes a walk around the town and encounters Miles again, and actually takes some time and talks with him. And he is really critical of the town, and he makes her feel so much better by confirming that she's not the only one who sees these people this way. And I don't know about you, but like if someone doesn't like me, I feel better if I know somebody else doesn't like them, you know, including me, of course. But so it seems like she takes a lot of comfort, gains some confidence from hearing him talk about the people in the town. And also, he seemed to really like her, so he seemed to help her regain her sense of superiority over them. She's not successful at interesting Will in poetry. So this is kind of a quelch on her first attempt at reform. She tries reading to him. He is bored and disinterested, tapping his fingers all along, and she just kind of gives up on that one pretty quick. And then she goes again to the Jolly 17 at the end of chapter 10, and you know, she's a changed woman, really. She acts very meek and quiet. She talks about the things that they're interested in talking about. She doesn't try any reforms at this point, and everybody seems to generally accept her a lot better than they have in the past. So, so anyway, I think that all these chapters, as I was talking to Dr. Rothman the other day on the telephone, I was telling him how much I identified with Carol, and he said, "Oh, how sad." You know, and I was like, well, you know, like I said, in the duality of it, in some respects, I think that she seems to be very snobby, you know, really pushing her beliefs on other people. You know, some people are really happy playing bridge. You know, it's not like you're saving them from something if it's something that they enjoy, and she just refuses to see that. But in other ways, you know, in her insecurities and in her hopefulness and in her naivete, I think that she's very admirable throughout these chapters, and I really did sympathize with her through a lot of this. So if no one has any questions about that, then that's all I have to say. Anyone?
Thank you, Ms. Garcia. We're covering a great deal of information, and we also get information and insight into the personalities of the townspeople. We're a little uncomfortable, in fact we're very uncomfortable, I believe, in chapter 10 when Carol's husband suggests that she buy her groceries at Jensen and Ludelmeyer's. I'm sorry, this is chapter 8. We're uncomfortable with the fact that Will asks her to buy her groceries at Jensen or Ludelmeyer instead of Howland and Gold. The reason is that Howland and Gold do not patronize his medical practice. So we discover that there are certain economic pressures and exchanges that Sinclair Lewis is impressing upon us. Now, whether this is equitable, whether the doctor should not patronize the grocer because the grocer doesn't give him business, is a matter of ethics. It's a matter of morality. It's a matter of economics. We wonder whether there are religious differences and national differences that create distinctions of an onerous sort that will, in fact, give us a very dark picture of the doctor, and certainly a dark picture of the community. But these become some of the pressures. Now, when you read a novel, of course, the assumption is that these characters become alive. And we almost look at Carol Kennicott as a real person, and her husband as a real person, as Maus Bjorstam is a real person. But these are, of course, characters invented, created, fictionalized by Sinclair Lewis. And yet they tell a story, and he directs the story in certain ways. Now, the amount of information that the writer delivers in a story, to a large extent, tells us how strong a writer he is. And what I'd like to do for a few moments is look at an interesting concept here called the greases. Now that looks like an innocent word to you, or a word of nonsense. But in fact, a good novelist, a good writer, penetrates the parameters and the deep structure of his society. And if you look at each of these letters as being part of an acronym, they really stand for a number of issues that are raised in any good novel. What, in fact, do we learn about government? That's the G of the Greases. Notice, G-R-E-A-S-E-S. What do we learn about government when we read a novel? Does it inform us about the way the community is governed, the way people govern themselves? Government includes family, it includes the city, it includes the state, it includes identification with human beings in general. What do we learn about the religion of a society in a novel? What do we learn about the economics of a novel, the economics of a society? Certainly when we discover how a writer writes, and we'll, in the next half, get some real insight into the rhetoric of the novel. We study the way the author operates, the way he plots his ideas, the way he creates his characters, the way he designs his descriptions. And we get some idea of the aesthetics of the novel. And we also learn about the art and architecture of the time. Another category is science and technology. What do we learn about the science and technology of the culture? What kind of education are we taught? What should we read? What do we discover we need to know more about? And finally, in what ways does the author introduce us to the variegations of social culture? When Miss Garcia spoke about the duality of these characters, for each character there's someone who acts oppositely or thinks differently. We have a really interesting study of the dichotomies and the differences, and we understand that there are oppositions. And in Main Street there are clear oppositions, which of course I had mentioned before a critic did not give us in Elmer Gantry. Now what I'd like to do is take a few moments to look at these Greases. Let's look back at our chart. When I originally produced this chart, I had listed that Sinclair Lewis lived from 1885 to 1851. I've just corrected that. But between the years of 1885 and 1951, what opportunities do we have for studying culture through the eyes of Sinclair Lewis? And in this novel in particular, what insights do we get on the Greases just in Main Street? You've had a chance to read this material. I wonder if anyone has thought about what Sinclair Lewis says about government, or whether off the top of your head you might be able to discover one or two points that Sinclair Lewis mentions. Does anything come to mind? Ms. Pavlok?
On page 11, city planning.
What does she say about city? What does he say about city planning? I think at some point there was some concern about how the garden should be shaped or something. Am I right there? Let me see. Oh yeah, what does she say there? All right, so that's a good sign of government, and certainly in the 1920s, it's really quite advanced to be so concerned. Now, of course, we have Jefferson, the example of Thomas Jefferson, who laid out the city of Washington. So city planning is nothing new to American culture, but to see it in Main Street, to see Carroll thinking about this as a career, suggests that there are governmental initiatives one must take in order to turn these towns from the sad towns she sees to a more imaginative type of structure. Is there anything else? Let's look at the next subject, religion. What do we learn about religion in Main Street? Any comments? Anyone? Just speak up. All right, and what? All right, so the revivals have become a tired form of religious expression, and this becomes part of Sinclair Lewis's satire. Any other perspective on religion? Mr. Barkowski, yes. Had Charles been ridiculed because of something he had said that was anti-religious, or was it just an ambiguous statement there?
Apparently he was dozing off in class, and he was following a fly that was buzzing around in the classroom.
Any other references to religion? We've got the revival, we've got the retired minister who's teaching history, and I think that Sinclair Lewis might imply there that maybe this isn't necessarily the best person to teach history. It might be from a biased standpoint. Ms. Garcia?
In Chapter 6, when she meets the neighbor, Mrs. Bogart criticizes her for not attending services and says she hopes that they're going to be coming to the Baptist services. So I thought it was pretty interesting that it was such a big part of their culture, and that was one reason she hadn't felt accepted before then, or that she might not be accepted by her neighbors.
Is the implication that Carol is going to attend this church, do you think? Or do you think that she will purposely resist this church because she has been vilified or attacked for not attending? Is she going to resist because it's purposeful to resist, or is she going to join because it's purposeful to join?
I really couldn't tell from the text there how she was going to react to it, but I just felt that she felt it was one other way that she was being locked out of society, that wasn't something that she, had a lot of experience with, this particular religion or something that she believed in, but it was another way that she felt different or excluded.
No, notice how Sinclair Lewis does this. Of course, it's the capability and the creativity of the author. He finds ventures, he finds activities, he finds the practices of the people of the town to become, and he works them as the vehicle by which we honor Carol's intentions or despair of her intentions. And so we come by a circuitous route to understand how Carol is going to be persuaded either to accept the town, to become involved in the town, if she wishes to so become involved in the town, or we're going to see how she further alienates herself from the townspeople. But always it comes to us circuitously through these various experiences that are understood in terms of the Greases. Anything more about religion? It's a unique and a pristine type of religion that perhaps hasn't yet penetrated the Midwest. And so she brings it to her from brings her knowledge of Christian Science from the big city. And again, the way Sinclair Lewis approaches it, Christian Science is considered either a minimal religion or a religion that has a certain degree of alterity. It's another option that very few people have at that point accepted, right? Mr. Borkowski, you had your hand up.
taking characters from mythology and playing them out to go for art mythology.
All right, so her youth and the type of religion she celebrates as she enters Gopher Prairie become two sequences which give us some insight into the personality, the growth, and the development of Carol Kennicott's personality. Indeed, as we begin penetrating Main Street and we discover the cornucopia of ideas, of images, of descriptions, of details, of data that Sinclair Lewis supplies, we realize that he is examining in detail the society that he wants us to inhabit in Main Street. The society has other ramifications. Let's look, for example, at the economics of Main Street. I already mentioned to you Will's concern about his medical practice. He'll only patronize those people who patronize him. So this, of course, is a very real economic insight, or insight into the economics of medical practice, human business. Are there any other observations on the economics in Main Street?
Well, whenever Carol tried,
yes.
yeah, whenever Carol tried to get anything done for the town, money was always an issue. It was a blockade for her trying to get things done. You know, like the library committee and buying books. They didn't want to raise the amount of stamps or whatever for the books. You know, at the same time, after paying for the library's wages and everything else, they didn't have any money left for the books, so forth.
All right. That's one example, and it's certainly a telling example. How is Carol going to raise this money? Why doesn't the community raise it? What are people going to read? It's perhaps one of the reasons why the librarians are so careful about making sure that the children don't read the books and that vagrants don't read the books, because they don't have enough money to buy new books, and they're very particular about the type of books that they do buy. Are there any other economic details that Sinclair Lewis gives us that either raises issues, provokes concerns, or attacks the status quo? Mr. Dornbus?
Sorry, unless anybody else has anything to contribute. There was separation of the classes. There was a lot of issue about that point. You know, about the poor Swedish people. You know, we don't want to associate with them. That sort of deal.
Yes, there are very, very clear distinctions. Can we get more of those? I think we have a large number, certainly on the train ride to Gopher Prairie. She is offended by people who are poorly dressed, eating their meals out of brown bags on the train, right? And other issues of an economic value. Did you find any others, Mr. Dornbus?
No specific examples.
All right, but you're right. You're right. There is this. Ms. Pavlock, you had something?
I don't know where it was mentioned, but I recall that that she knew it wouldn't be right for her to work since she's the wife of a doctor.
Right. And in the 1920s, in fact, in the 1920s, the wife of the doctor was pretty much expected to stay at home and take messages if they came in and the doctor was out. Yes, Ms. Mahan?
Along the same lines, I think it was pretty well known that the doctor is one of the more rich people in the city, but even he is worried about money. In chapter 14, he says, of course, a doctor gets a regular stated amount, sure, 1,000 one month, and lucky if he makes 100 the next. So even he, who makes more money than most people, is concerned about his income and considers it unstable.
Well, when we resume after the break, I think we'll have a chance to look at more of the Greases as we hear two others of our speakers address issues on Main Street. Thank you.